You're standing in the grand halls of Versailles on a sweltering August morning in 1715, watching as King Louis XIV writhes in agony on his deathbed. The Sun King, who once commanded all of Europe, now lies helpless as his royal physicians prepare their final treatment. They heat iron rods until they glow white hot, then press them against his gangrenous leg, believing the searing flesh will somehow restore his health. The smell of burning skin mingles with the heavy perfume that courtiers use to mask the stench of infection. "This is medicine fit for a king," they whisper. But what you're witnessing isn't healing. It's torture dressed up as treatment, sanctioned by the greatest minds of the age and inflicted on the most powerful people in the world. Before diving into these forgotten stories of royal suffering disguised as medical care, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The truth about royal medical care will shatter every assumption you've ever had about privilege and power. While peasants might die from neglect, kings and queens died from attention. Too much attention. The wrong kind of attention. Attention from physicians who believed that the more exotic, expensive, and agonizing the treatment, the more likely it was to work. These weren't backward charlatans practicing folk medicine. These were the most educated, respected doctors in Europe, armed with university degrees and royal appointments, systematically torturing their patients in the name of science. The royal bloodletting obsession reached levels that would make a modern vampire recoil in horror. When King Charles II of England suffered what was likely a stroke in February 1685, his team of 14 physicians immediately sprang into action. They drained 16 ounces of blood from his right arm, then another 8 ounces from his left shoulder. But they were just getting started. Over the next 4 days, they would extract a total of 24 ounces of blood from various parts of his body, using heated cups, razors, and leeches. To put this in perspective, the average human body contains about 10 pints of blood. Charles lost nearly 3 pints in 4 days while fighting for his life. The physicians didn't stop at bloodletting. They shaved his head and applied blistering agents to raise painful welts on his scalp, believing this would draw out the evil humours causing his illness. They forced him to swallow antimony, a toxic metal that induced violent vomiting and diarrhea. They administered mercury, which slowly poisoned his nervous system. They gave him extracts of human skull, believing that consuming the remains of the dead would somehow restore life to the dying. When Charles finally died, it wasn't from his stroke. It was from the treatments meant to save him. But Charles was hardly unique. The medical records of European royalty read like a catalogue of systematic torture. Consider the case of Queen Anne of England, who suffered from what modern doctors believe was lupus, a chronic autoimmune disease. Her physicians, convinced that her swollen joints and facial rashes were caused by corrupted blood, subjected her to regular bloodletting sessions that left her weak and anemic. They prescribed mercury treatments that caused her teeth to fall out and her gums to turn black. They applied caustic substances to her skin, creating painful burns they called healing blisters. The most disturbing aspect of Anne's treatment was the obsession with her reproductive system. Royal physicians believed that her frequent miscarriages and the death of all 18 of her children were caused by an excess of female humours that needed to be purged from her body. They subjected her to brutal internal examinations, forced her to drink concoctions made from ground pearls and powdered unicorn horn, and applied heated irons to her abdomen. The treatments were so painful that Anne would sometimes lose consciousness, which her doctors interpreted as a positive sign that the evil spirits were leaving her body. The Spanish royal family endured perhaps the most grotesque medical treatments of all. thanks to their court physicians' obsession with purification through suffering. When Prince Philip Prospero, the heir to the Spanish throne, began showing signs of developmental delays in 1658, his doctors decided that his condition was caused by demonic possession. Their solution was to perform what they called therapeutic exorcism, combined with medical intervention. They forced the 4-year-old prince to drink mixtures containing ground human bones, believing that the remains of saints would drive out evil spirits. They applied red-hot irons to various parts of his body, creating deliberate burns that they claimed would serve as exits for the demons. The prince's diet was restricted to foods that had been blessed by priests and mixed with holy water. He was given daily enemas containing wine, mercury, and crushed pearls. Most horrifically, his physicians regularly cut small incisions in his scalp and inserted pieces of gold, believing that the precious metal would attract and trap any remaining evil influences. Philip Prospero died at the age of 4, his small body unable to survive the constant assault of his treatments. French royalty faced their own medical nightmares, particularly during the reign of Louis XIV. The Sun King's physicians were obsessed with the concept of royal blood being fundamentally different from common blood, and therefore requiring special treatments. When Louis suffered from an anal fistula in 1686, his doctors decided that ordinary surgery was beneath his royal dignity. Instead, they designed a series of increasingly elaborate procedures that would take place over several months. First, they inserted silver probes deep into the infected area, believing that the precious metal would purify the wound from within. When this failed to provide relief, they began injecting the fistula with solutions containing ground diamonds, reasoning that the hardest substance on earth would somehow strengthen the king's flesh. The pain was excruciating, but Louis was forbidden from showing weakness in front of his courtiers. He would grip the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white, sweat pouring down his face as the physicians worked. The French court physicians also pioneered the use of what they called sympathetic treatments, based on the belief that like cured like. When Louis XIV's son, the Grand Dauphin, developed smallpox in 1711, his doctors decided that since the disease created pustules on the skin, the cure must involve deliberately creating similar wounds. They used heated needles to puncture hundreds of holes across his body, then rubbed salt and vinegar into the wounds. They forced him to lie on beds of thorns, believing that the constant pricking sensation would somehow compete with the smallpox and drive it from his system. The most disturbing treatments were reserved for royal women during childbirth, when court physicians believed they had the opportunity to purify both mother and child through carefully orchestrated suffering. When Marie Antoinette went into labor with her first child in 1778, the royal birthing chamber became a theater of medical horror. The Queen was forced to give birth in front of dozens of courtiers, as tradition demanded. But what the witnesses saw was a woman being systematically tortured by her own doctors. The physicians had decided that royal births required enhancement to ensure the child would be born with properly noble blood. They applied heated metal instruments to Marie Antoinette's abdomen during contractions, believing the pain would strengthen both her resolve and the baby's constitution. They forced her to drink mixtures containing ground rubies and emeralds, reasoning that precious stones would imbue the child with royal qualities. Most grotesquely, they inserted burning herbs into her birth canal, claiming this would illuminate the path for the baby's arrival. When the child finally emerged, the physicians weren't finished. They immediately began treating the newborn with procedures they claimed would enhance its royal nature. The infant was bathed in wine mixed with gold dust, had its eyes washed with solutions containing crushed pearls, and was fed drops of mercury dissolved in holy water. That this child survived at all was a miracle that had nothing to do with medical intervention. The obsession with treating royal madness led to some of the most sadistic procedures ever devised by medical minds. When King George III of England began showing signs of mental illness in 1788, his physicians concluded that his condition stemmed from an overabundance of hot humours in his brain that needed to be cooled and expelled. Their solution was a treatment regimen that would have been considered torture if applied to common criminals. They strapped the king into a specially designed chair that they called the restraint throne, where he would remain motionless for hours while they performed their procedures. They shaved his head completely and applied ice-cold metal plates to his scalp, believing this would freeze the madness at its source. They forced tubes down his throat and poured gallons of ice water into his stomach, causing violent convulsions that they interpreted as the madness being physically expelled from his body. Perhaps most horrifically, they decided that the king's condition required the removal of corrupt thoughts through direct intervention. They drilled small holes in his skull and inserted thin metal rods that they heated until they glowed, then stirred them around inside his brain tissue. The king's screams could be heard throughout the palace, but his physicians assured the royal family that the louder he screamed, the more successful the treatment was proving to be. The treatment of royal children was particularly heartbreaking because it combined medical ignorance with the belief that young royals needed to be hardened through suffering to prepare them for their future roles. When the infant son of Tsar Peter III of Russia developed what was likely a simple fever in 1761, the court physicians launched into an elaborate treatment protocol designed to burn out the weakness from his royal blood. They placed the baby in a specially constructed metal cradle that could be heated from below, reasoning that if fever was the problem, then more heat would somehow solve it. The infant was forced to lie in this heated cage for hours at a time, while physicians applied various burning substances to his skin. They rubbed his body with mixtures containing sulfur and saltpeter, creating chemical burns across his tiny form. They forced him to breathe vapors from heated mercury, which slowly poisoned his developing nervous system. The baby's diet consisted entirely of liquids that had been purified through processes that removed most of their nutritional value. He was fed wine that had been boiled with lead weights, water that had been stored in silver containers for months until it turned green, and milk that had been mixed with ground glass because physicians believed the sharp particles would cut away disease from the inside. The child died within weeks, his small body unable to survive the constant assault disguised as medical care. Royal dental care represented perhaps the most visible intersection of medical ignorance and aristocratic vanity. When Empress Catherine II of Russia began experiencing tooth pain in 1782, her court physicians decided that the problem wasn't just dental decay, but a fundamental corruption of her royal essence that was manifesting through her teeth. Their solution was to remove not just the affected teeth, but to systematically replace her entire mouth with what they considered more suitable royal alternatives. They extracted healthy teeth one by one, using crude iron tools that frequently broke off pieces of jawbone in the process. Each extraction was performed without any form of pain relief, as physicians believed that the empress needed to remain fully conscious to participate in her own purification. The removed teeth were replaced with alternatives carved from the bones of saints, which physicians claimed would imbue her words with holy power. But the bone teeth quickly rotted in her mouth, creating infections that spread throughout her jaw and skull. The physician's response was to remove more bone, carving away pieces of her jaw until her face began to collapse inward. They filled the resulting cavities with mixtures of gold, silver, and mercury, creating a toxic environment that slowly poisoned her nervous system. Catherine spent her final years unable to eat solid food, speaking in whispers through her ruined mouth, her face a grotesque mask of surgical scars and metallic implants. As you walk through the opulent museums and palaces that once housed these royal patients, remember that beneath the gilded surfaces and priceless artworks lie the echoes of screams that no amount of gold could silence. The crimson stains on marble floors weren't always from spilled wine, and the heavy perfumes that once filled these halls served a purpose far more sinister than mere luxury. They masked the stench of burning flesh, rotting wounds, and the slow decay of human dignity disguised as divine right. These weren't isolated incidents or the work of a few deranged physicians. This was an entire system built on the twisted logic that suffering equaled healing, that the more a treatment hurt, the more effective it must be. The most educated minds of their time, armed with university degrees and royal appointments, systematically tortured their patients while genuinely believing they were providing the finest medical care available. Perhaps the most disturbing truth is that these royal patients had no choice but to endure treatments that would be considered war crimes today. Their crowns became prisons, their palaces transformed into chambers of medical horror, where escape meant abandoning everything they'd been born to inherit. The very wealth and status that should have protected them instead made them targets for increasingly elaborate forms of sanctified torture. The next time you hear someone romanticize the good old days of royal splendor, remember these stories. Power and privilege couldn't save these monarchs from the ignorance of their age, and their suffering reminds us that progress in medicine, like democracy itself, can never be taken for granted. Sometimes the price of a crown was paid not in gold, but in screams that echoed through palace halls long after the last physician had packed away his heated irons and departed into the night.